Hi, everyone. Welcome to the new normal. I'm your host, Lisa Davis, aka Litecoin Lisa. And today, SL369 Crypto has brought an amazing astrologer, Robert Phoenix. You guys might have heard of his podcast, 15 Minutes of Flame, his daily show. We're going to teach you more about that. He's going to be here telling us about the Pluto return of America. And we'll be right back after this. SL, welcome back. I feel like I just saw you. Robert is joining us on his a little bit windy balcony, but we're so glad to have him here with us. And SL, can you kind of tell us how you found Robert and what he's going to be telling us about today?
Yes. So one of my member, he had been with me for over a year. He had been talking a lot about astrologer Robin, where he does a lot of astrology, and that member had been talking a lot about the Pluto return of America, and he told me some very horrific events that will take place when a country or nation go through the Pluto return of America, the Pluto returns. So he told me that I think Roman Empire had two Pluto return, and a second Pluto return, the whole empire collapsed. So I was really curious, what will we see right now that America is going through the Pluto return? So I'm really curious what he had to share with us and the audience.
Okay, so Robert, can you tell us a little bit about, some of us have heard of the Pluto return, some people haven't. Can you tell us what that date is, what it is, and how it might affect the United States of America?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me on, and I appreciate being here, and I hope I can share some information that people can begin to process and do it in a way that's hopefully not too fear-based, because a lot of the things that we're going through right now in terms of the planet are designed to amp your cortisol levels and get you revved up and put you in a fight or flight kind of mentality, and nobody makes really good decisions in those states. So I'll try to talk about these things in ways that you can wrap your head around it, and hopefully it's useful energy, and it's energy and information allows you to prepare accordingly. Because if you can prepare for something, you won't be unaware when the things happen. We also don't want to live in a world of self-fulfilling prophecy. I have a friend who was texting me the other day on Twitter, and she brought up an astrologer's post on a forum, and we're coming through this very interesting period where the Pluto return has just taken place, or it's begun to take place. But in addition to Pluto, there was also Venus and Mars that were at the same degree as Pluto, also in conjunction. Conjunction means when two things are together, with the United States Pluto. And this person was talking about how during the State of the Union address, just this last few days, that there's a very high probability that based on these astrological alignments, that the Chinese were going to launch an EMP against the United States during the State of the Union. And if you know anything about astrology and the way that he was talking about it, well, he could have made a compelling case for that. So this friend of mine texted me this. I'm like, well, let's back off of this for a minute. So is this going to be true? I mean, he's using astrological information to set the stage for an event that could be absolutely catastrophic. And my sense was that this was not going to happen. And I was correct, even though he was using the astrology to justify his position. And that's the thing about astrology, is that it's very easy to take something and make it either ideological or conform to some kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that you've already constructed in your head. We have to be very careful of that. So it didn't happen, right? The thing that he said was going to happen didn't happen. And then I said to her, I said, well, look, what happens if it does happen? If it does happen, then there's always going to be something that comes out of the thing that occurs. Well, let's say there is a giant EMP and the lights go out. Well, maybe people could all of a sudden realize that they'd have to pull together and pool their resources. And in the dark, you have to find allies, right? And so it could be one of those things that could accelerate us into, you know, bringing our assets and bringing our available energy together so we could all survive, right? And maybe that would be a good thing that could come out of something like that. So, I mean, even though we're in a time where we're talking about things like potential economic collapse, which is something that we'll cover today, there are also things that can come out of this time that can be indirectly positive or indirectly resolved in a very different kind of way. So before we get into the Pluto return, I do want to talk about an event that took place on December 21st in 2020, and that was the super conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in the sign of Aquarius. And this is a really important astrological aspect, and it does affect things like cryptocurrency, decentralization, more personal sovereignty, groups that don't necessarily want to be aligned or affiliated with traditional kinds of groups. So let's say we have the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Well, in the age of Aquarius, which we're theoretically entering into, that there are alternative parties or alternative groups or alternative ways of looking at the world and how we interact with natural resources, economies, people from other beliefs, faiths, cultures, etc. Right. So on the 21st, which is the solstice, the winter solstice, we have this major aspect where Jupiter and Saturn join and make this immense luminary in the sky. Now, prior to that, Saturn had been in Aquarius, and we saw what Saturn in Aquarius was like. It was during the time of the lockdown. Like, it's like, boom, Saturn goes into Aquarius almost right when the lockdown is happening. So Saturn deals with top-down structures and hierarchies. And Aquarius has to deal with things like science, revolutions, outside-the-box thinking, creative destruction, liberation, genius, madness. It's all there with Aquarius. So what happens during that time is that we get moved into this global event where Aquarius is global. We're all having the same experience theoretically simultaneously. So that's where we get introduced into Aquarius, but we're getting introduced to it via Saturn. So we have these Saturnian figures that emerge, like Tony Fauci, who happens to be a Capricorn, and Saturn rules Capricorn. He's this high priest of science, and he's actually more important at that time and more powerful than, say, Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is old paradigm. Donald Trump is a Capricorn. Even though he's a Gemini, he represents the Capricornian world that we've lived in, which has to do with things like politics and business and corporations. So when Fauci comes along, we have this new player in the mix, and he's the high priest of science. He's the high priest of Aquarius, and he's telling everybody what to do, right? There's a new orthodoxy, there's a new sacrament, and then we have to do it because it's for the greater good, right? So we also have other figures like Bill Gates and Tedros Adhanom, the guy from the WHO, and then you get to see these other people emerge, like Jacinda Ardern, and it's not one person anymore. We're seeing these global figures all come together and say, you got to stay home, you got to wear a mask, you got to get a shot, you're going to have to get your vax papers. This is Saturn in Aquarius. It's very hardcore, it's very top down, it's very hierarchical, but it's hierarchical in the sense that it's global now. Like, instead of being vertical with one figure like a president, or one figure like the head of a corporation or a queen, now it's horizontal. And then you have these groups that are involved. You have the WHO, you have the NIH, you've got Gavi, the Gates Foundation. So all these foundations begin to move into play. And those are very Aquarian. So the Aquarian ideal now is beginning to be imprinted upon the people, but it's from the top down. And that's not really Aquarian, right? Aquarian is omnidimensional. Aquarian is really decentralized. Aquarian is anarchic. You look at the punk rock movement in the 1970s, it's an anarchic movement. It has nothing to do with record labels, even though the Sex Pistols signed the 3 very powerful record labels. It does give birth to the DIY culture, which is very important when we're talking about Aquarius. So when we get the super conjunction, Jupiter comes into the discussion, and it changes everything because Jupiter is expansive and it presents more possibilities. So on the 21st, we begin this 20-year cycle of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, because that's how these super conjunctions work. They're based on 20-year cycles. So for the next 20 years now, we're in this very interesting wash where there's the contraction phase of Saturn, and then there's the expansion phase of Jupiter. So it's a very powerful metaphor, because when we get into contraction and expansion, we're talking about the process of birth, right? So we're birthing a new culture, and some of that birthing process does have to do with restriction, and it does have to do with things that we're not really happy with. And then the expansion process has to do with possibilities and what kind of world do we want to create. If we want to step out of a centralized paradigm, then what does a decentralized paradigm look like? And so then we begin to talk about things like cryptocurrency, the role that cryptocurrency plays. So that's, that's a big part of where we are now. So we're in a much longer cycle. We're in this 20-year period where it's very hard to judge what happens. And this is what I've learned about the sign of Aquarius. And by the way, with the Pluto return, Pluto's currently at 27 degrees Capricorn. So it's at the end of this Capricorn cycle, which lasts 248 years. That's how long a Pluto cycle lasts. We're at the end of this Pluto cycle. And we finally are through a lot of the retrogrades, because planets go forward, they go backward. The retrograde position is fairly significant, and we can talk about that. We're not fully out of this until 2024, and that's when Pluto moves into Aquarius. And so we're moving into that time where something new comes along, right? This new thing that we're going to be a part of comes out of this phase and cycle that we're in. And one of the things that I've learned about Aquarius is that things don't always go according to plan, which I think is very hopeful. Because if you look at, say, Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum and the Fourth Industrial Revolution and the Great Reset, that's all very top-down, very dark Aquarian. Because what we're doing is we're starting with a hierarchy, which is Klaus Schwab, and then he has all these people who are part of the World Economic Forum, young global leaders and stuff like that, right, who are all placed inside of things like government, media, medicine. So it is still a top-down hierarchy, and they're using the language, and they're using an ideology which feels very Aquarian, for the greater good. And they'll get into this idea of climate change and the sacrifices that we have to make for the greater good. And, all these things will come along, and they're trying to birth this version of Aquarius. And they control the technology, by the way, in this version of Aquarius. There's no innovation. The innovation that comes.
They're asking you to give up your freedoms so that they can then have the supreme control over all.
That's right.
And have the power over. They're creating a monopoly by you giving up your freedoms and your own individuality.
So what they do is they create a false sense of decentralization.
Right.
And it's a simulacrum.
They're actually centralizing your freedom.
But they're centralizing it. So they're running if it was my channel, I call it a mind F, right? They're running a great big mind F on everybody. And so that's what's happening. Now, Aquarius doesn't always work out that way, because Aquarius, you can't predict it. It's not predictable. So they can start off on that path, and they can have this idea that they're going to give us the simulacra of decentralization, which will look and feel like this kind of new age model. But you can't really do that with Aquarius. And one of the things that really tipped me off to this, and I've known it for inherently for a while, but I just did a deep dive on this guy by the name of Chuck Dieterich, who started this foundation called Synanon back in the late 50s. It was the first it was the first foundation to help people with drug addiction. And because before then there was this idea that you couldn't cure a heroin addict, like they're incurable. So he sets off to change that. And Chuck Dieterich is an Aquarius rising, and he has Mars in Aquarius. So he's a system buster, and that's what he does. He's going to prove that you can do it, and he sets up this for a while, this wildly successful foundation. But then it gets really crazy, and it turns into this like strange cult in a weird way, right? But for a while, it's wildly successful, and there are people who go to Synanon and they start taking all these notes and they start to apply a lot of Chuck Dieterich's ideas. Chuck Dieterich wasn't a psychologist. He didn't graduate from college. He took LSD one time at a study in UCLA. I think it was in 1956. It changed his world. He read Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he creates this new thing. And he believes that he's going to be a person that will change the world, that he will be a social reformer. And what happens is he winds up becoming a social pariah, because Synanon becomes this very strange story about a cult. But also in a weird way, he does become a social reformer. He does change the world. In Synanon, even though it turns into this very strange thing, the principles and the ideas of Synanon become commodified. And the recovery industry, as we know it today, is based on Synanon. So that's how Aquarius works. Like Chuck Dieterich set out to be a great man, and he set out to be a social reformer. And in a weird way, he was, but it didn't turn out the way that he thought it would, right? Like, that's how Aquarius works. So as we move into this Aquarian age, and we're in these birth pangs right now, I just want to share that with people, because everything that you see that's happening is mostly designed towards the end of decentralizing, but also making everything very vertical. And it's not, in my world, it's not going to work, because that's just how Aquarius works. So along the way, things will have innovation. People will innovate because we're naturally innovative. I mean, that's who we are. You know, people are, we're meme makers. You know, you have things like Doge and Shiba Inu, if we're going to talk about cryptocurrency, comes in, upsets the apple cart. You know, the big dog is Bitcoin. Well, how about this? Right? This is a very Aquarian kind of meme coin that attracts people. It attracts loyalty, which is very much associated with the dog, right? Dog's a very loyal symbol. So in terms of the Pluto return, I'll bring up an image through astro.com, and you can get a visualization of what it looks like. So while I'm doing that, if you want to comment anything I've shared or ask any questions, go ahead and do that.
Yeah, I thought your comment on being mindful about things that we're creating or things that we're manifesting, although, you know, we can see what astrology is, but good things can come out of bad. I had my husband sent me an article, or I think it was my husband. Somebody sent me an article this morning, and I was talking with my husband about it, that since Russia has been basically kicked out of the SWIFT system, they've now officially gone back to a gold-backed standard or gold-backed dollar. And I have to say that's a good thing for Russia. And so although maybe something bad was intended for them, that's really a stabilizing effect for Russia's economy, I would think. So I would think we can see more of those kind of things.
One of the things that comes to mind when you bring that up is I was watching a show, I think it was a Netflix special on all these chefs from around the world. And they had an episode about a Russian chef. And this was during the first round of sanctions that Obama started to lay on the Russians heavily. And so what happened during the first round of sanctions is that Putin forbade chefs at restaurants, markets, to use any American products. So they went through this period where they were destroying all American food that was either on shelves in Russian markets, or if you had it in your restaurant, you had to destroy it. And I thought, well, this is quite interesting. And what happened is that they were forced to look at, well, what's growing in our forests? What kind of fish are in our lakes and rivers and oceans? You know, what kind of beef and fowl do we have? And out of this emerged a brand new version of Russian cuisine. And it was through that kind of harsh stop that they were forced to rediscover like who they were from a gastronomic standpoint. So that speaks to what you're talking about and how when we deal with these limitations, at times they can lead to some form of improvement or some form of innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're going to see more of that. Maybe what was intended for when you were talking about the WEF and the WHO and all of that, what was intended to harm us, maybe being turned. And that's what I'm curious to see what the astrology says. Could that all be being turned on its head? I even think about the saying, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. Could that actually be turned on its head? And it be that,
absolutely.
These sayings about, the Saint Germain Trust and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I think about, well, maybe it's true that things will be in a trust and we'll own nothing. So we won't be responsible or have the liability of it. And we'll be happy because we'll be free from working because Bitcoin will be mined by volcanoes and we'll all be able to do art and focus on, all the beautiful mind kind of ideas. Like, could it be that some of those things, like I said, what was intended for us will be flipped on its head and made true, but for the good of humanity? So I'm curious to see what the astrology says about all of that.
Well, I think anything, I mean, just look at the last State of the Union address.
Oh, Lord.
So what was Biden doing? Biden was channeling Trump.
Yeah, other than plagiarizing Trump.
Yeah, right. That's exactly. Yeah. So that's a very Aquarian thing because they realize that they have to do this pivot. They have to do this rebrand. They do it coming out of, for all intents and purposes, a humiliation ritual, which is what COVID-19 was humiliation ritual.
Right.
People are traumatized and they're going to rebrand themselves. And they're going to flip this switch. It's like, hey, all of a sudden we're Kennedy Democrats and we're putting America first again. It's very Aquarian in a very sneaky kind of way, right? And that may not work for them. Right? It's just like you guys have, freaking lied to us for the last 2 years.
I hope I know people have a short attention span and a short memory, but I can't imagine people will forget this. I mean, I really hope they don't forget this. Yeah.
One would hope, but as we get bombarded with what's going on in Ukraine and with Russia, they'll bring up this kind of this displaced faux patriotism, right? They'll talk about freedom, they'll talk about liberation, they'll talk about all these principles, but they'll project it onto Ukraine.
Well, it's already being shown. I mean, if people will look, it's already being shown. So today, there's a video out of Lindsey Graham and John McCain in 2016 at Ukraine telling them, we will give you whatever you need to go pick a fight with Russia. Right. And magically at lunch, we're coming out and there's a video of Lindsey Graham making a statement to Trump's supporters saying that he's a xenophobe, bigoted, racist, whatever. I'm like, because Trump came in and stopped that from happening, stopped the Ukraine from going and attacking Russia. And so now what do you see happening? And then yesterday, the whole nuclear plant that went on fire, to come to find out that there was nothing nuclear there. And now there's stories about that.
Yes, it's like the bombing of the synagogue. And and somebody went there, some Israeli journalist went there, and there's the synagogue. Like, it's intact, it's fine, nothing happened. So, we're living in a very strange time where reality and surreality are merging. And so it's very difficult to tell what's real and what's not real. And what happens when that happens are people are caught floating in space and they have no ground in which to stand on, which is also very Aquarian too, because Aquarius rules. So it rules astrology. So there is this idea that Aquarius is connected to space, right? And so we're in this very ungrounded time. So the idea here is to not get attached to anything. Like, don't get attached to, well, this is the truth, and this guy over here is the person that's, you know, liberating and routing the adrenochrome pushers in Ukraine and all these different bioweapons labs. Like, that could be true. I'm not saying that's not true,
Right.
but don't get attached to it, because then you'll see something else and it'll be like, oh wow, well, there's that. And just like on the other side, if you're, you know, falling hook, line, and sinker for Ukraine as being the, you know, the underdog here, and we've got to do everything in our power to fight for Ukraine, we may want to open your eyes a little bit and see what they've been up to there. So the idea is to not be attached, because as a sign, Aquarius is a very detached sign. It's sort of like very observational. It's got this 30,000 foot view. And you don't want to be so detached that you're just like, I don't give a F, right?
Right, because it does affect you. But then why is someone pushing so hard for you to have this agenda about another country or what's going on?
Well, it takes what's going on. And so again, that's displacement, right? So if you look at this model of displacement, what they're doing is they're assigning all of these American values to Ukraine, and it's safe for them, right? Because it doesn't have anything to do with the American people. So it's transposition. Like, they're transposing these values onto the Ukrainians, and how Zelensky's a freedom fighter. And boy, don't we like the citizens arming themselves against the Russians. You know, it's this model of projection.
But they want you not to have. But then yesterday, literally, they're trying to pass through this legislation to take your guns away.
Absolutely. So it's this, it's transposition, it's projection, it's getting people on board with these values, but at the same time, it's a huge distraction. They've got things going on here that they're slipping through, right? It's like, let's get this through, let's get this through. And then you have Putin as the new Trump, right? And then there's the connections with Trump, theoretically, and they've worked very hard at trying to establish those connections. So now Putin is global, and you have a so-called war, and CNN, whose ratings were in the garbage disposal, right? Now all of a sudden, CNN's got a war. It's a 24/7 news cycle because there's always something to report on. So they become eye magnets, and now they have a new villain in the world. They, you know, it's every now and then they can bring Trump.
But they also have new ownership, complete new ownership, and new. I mean, they put Chris Wallace over there, but they took away his staff. You know, he's not a little, you know, he doesn't have all his lapdogs anymore. And they have, like I said, new ownership. They're owned by the Discovery Channel, which is a Christian guy. So it's a whole new ball game under the same wrapping.
Right.
So
I think everything that going on has been very interesting. The war in Ukraine. I think we can talk about this for a long time. I'm really curious how the Pluto return to America, like how
it's destabilizing. So the war in Ukraine fits into the destabilization of the United States and its economy. And so this is a very interesting connection, synchronistically. So if you go back and you look at when Yanukovych was deposed in 2014, he actually leaves Ukraine on 2/22/14. So theoretically, on 2/22/14, Ukraine becomes a new country. And on 2/22/2022, this is when we begin to talk about the Pluto return of the United States. And on 2/22/22, you had Donetsk and Lugansk basically saying we want to be independent states, which is interesting because on July 4th, 1776, there's a Declaration of Independence. So you have, again, this weird kind of mirror image of these two breakaway states performing the same thing that is connected to the United States on July 4th, 1776 with Pluto. So there's this weird mirroring going on. And the Pluto return is economic, because when we look at where Pluto is, the United States chart, it's connected to the second house. And the second house is about money. It's about hard assets, money, and resources. Okay. And what happened with the United States is that the United States became one of the huge economic powers in the world. How did they do it? It was their relationship with things like drugs, gas, oil, and pharmaceuticals. That's Neptune at the top of the chart there. So what we have here is a trine between Pluto and Neptune. And Neptune's the highest planet in the US chart based on the 1776 model. So you can see the baseline for a lot of the resources and assets for the United States come out of this Neptunian world. Standard Oil, the Rockefellers, and all the energy that is connected to that. You have Bretton Woods, the reset of the dollar. There's a reset where basically the dollar is set up to be, the reserve currency for the world. That's all right here with Neptune and Pluto and trine, and it's connected with Saudi Arabia, which is a foreign country. That's the ninth house. So when you have a Pluto return, all these things come back into focus, right? They come back into focus, and there's the ending of that cycle. Like, so everything that was built up from the Rockefellers and, Atlantic Richfield and, everything that they did with the Seven Sisters and the petrodollar and the rise of the pharmaceutical business, which is Neptunian, right? That's right in there as well. They're connected to that. They push allopathy, essentially industrial medical production, things like the iron lung, the X-ray machine. That all comes out of that period where the Rockefellers take all that over. And so what do we see happen during this time? We see the introduction of a new phase of the pharmaceutical industry with synthetic vaccines, right? And then that all goes away very quickly. It gets bottomed out. What do we see now? We're seeing the rise in oil costs. It's like massive. And by the way, we're still buying oil from Russia.
Mm-hmm.
That hasn't stopped. Isn't that interesting? No. So if you really wanted to cripple Russia, you just stop buying their oil. But no, we're still buying their oil. So when the Pluto return comes around, all these things come into focus, and it's a reset of the assets that have made America one of the most powerful countries in the world in terms of leveraging things like credit, fiat economies, the Federal Reserve. That's all in there as well. So we're coming to the end of that time, and we're coming into this deconstructive phase, and all these things that we've depended upon they're very fragile at this point in time. Very, very fragile. And as we go through all of these events, which are connected to the Pluto return, which in my estimation really started on January, was it 5th, 6th of 2019. And that's when we had the Saturn-Pluto conjunction right there at 25 degrees. Like, that was a big, big time. That kicks off COVID. And that kicks off this domino effect of, okay, this game is over now. Like, we have taken and bled everything out of this system, and we've taken. We're gonna run this for one more big tranche of sending a bunch of money out through Trump and through the personal protection PPE, right? That whole thing. Like that. What that really is a massive transference of wealth. It's like this big one more time of massively transferring wealth. And it happens during that phase. And then what also happens during that phase, which is a really important thing that people really don't understand, is that Trump then brings BlackRock. He reorganizes the Treasury and the Fed. And he puts BlackRock right in between the Treasury and the Fed. So BlackRock is able to get free money from the Fed and then make financial advice to the Treasury. So this is something that's never been done before. And again, this is all part of the Pluto return because it's setting up a new system while they deconstruct and take the old system apart. So when we talk about what's going on in Ukraine, we're talking about, again, it's like watching the Twin Towers fall a story at a time. Like that's what's going on right now. So what's going to be the impact of oil that's $115 a barrel? Well, you're going to pay $7 a gallon per gas in California. How's that going to affect your pocketbook? It's going to be very difficult. So it's going to impact people on a personal level. So we'll wind up getting things like inflation and stagflation, which is thought to be impossible almost simultaneously. So what's happening in Ukraine is set up to be the next level of what they started with COVID, which is ultimately the destruction of the fiat system. They have to destroy it. There's nothing left. There's no more meat on that bone, right? They could just keep pumping out all these fake dollars into infinity, but there's nothing there. So what they have to do is they have to bring in a new economy. So the Pluto return for the United States begins that process because it's happening in the second house, which is hard assets, things like gold, things like silver, things like land, things that actually mean something. And so what they're doing is they're destroying those things. Like they're destroying the dollar. Their BlackRock is coming in and buying residential real estate, like they're a Death Star. BlackRock and Bill Gates are coming in. Bill Gates comes in and buys all this farmland, which is assets, right? And so this is what we're seeing now. We're seeing this rise of these new oligarchic powers, but they're not the same as the old ones. The old ones you can look at and say, well, there's J.P. Morgan, there's Rockefeller, there's Carnegie, there's Mellon, right? You can't do that now. What you see is foundations, and what you see are consortiums, and you see groups, and you see hedge funds, and you see people like BlackRock. Like these are the new oligarchs, and they're Aquarian, right? They're Aquarian. Like Larry Fink doesn't own BlackRock, but Larry Fink is the face of BlackRock. BlackRock is a group. That's Aquarian consciousness. So this is what they're doing now, and they're using these NGOs, they're using these foundations, and Vanguard and First Street, and they're decimating the economy. That's what's happening. And Russia and the Ukrainian war is playing a role in that. It's part of a much bigger process and plan to ultimately move us into a centralized digital currency. And that's where the Pluto return is taking place. And there's more to it than that. But that's, if we want to talk about it in terms of what your viewers are into, what you talk about, that's a good jumping off place.
So you said that what's going on with Ukraine and Russia right now is setting up to the collapse of the fiat currency.
Yes.
Do you have a date? Do you have a date of when the fiat currency will collapse?
So when we talk about Pluto and the Pluto return, one of the things that the outer planets do is that they go through a lot of direct and retrograde cycles. So Pluto will go direct, meaning it's moving forward. And then it goes retrograde on July 4th. If I'm not mistaken, right around July 4th, which is kind of a big time. Like this Pluto cycle around July 4th, like that's a date I would circle on your calendar. Like that's a significant day. Is that the day that the fiat collapses? I'm not entirely sure about that. But I guarantee you, one of these dates where Pluto goes either station or retrograde will be very instrumental. We've got a 2-year run, and I believe the last Pluto retrograde direct cycle is October of 2023. I think it's around October 10th or 11th of 2023. So, we're not out of this Pluto cycle until 2024, like January 2024. We're finally into Aquarius. And I believe that's when they want to have a centralized digital currency. So we're in a 2-year phase now. And if this thing took theoretically 200 years to build, but if we really want to place it in the modern context, the second industrial revolution happens in the late 1800s. So really from the late 1800s till now, like decimating that kind of infrastructure, those kinds of systems, it takes time, and they have to chip away at it. And they have to chip away at it so they don't lose their assets in the process. And they have to get maximum amount of pain out of people while also indoctrinating them and rewarding them to be in a new system. So it takes time. We're like in a big Skinner box right now. And I would say somewhere between now and 2022, and I would look towards October, that October period, 2023, where we could be looking at the coup de grace, right? The final drop.
Okay, let's see here. So I wrote down some of these dates that you're talking about, the last Pluto return and out of Pluto. So this is a process definitely that we're going through. When do you, let's see, how long did Pluto return to? Well, I think I kind of answered that.
So
go ahead, SL.
Yeah. So does it mean that the U.S. sort of like lose their power or ranking in the world, and we are no longer the most powerful country in the world from now going?
Well, that's already happened. Mm-hmm. So if you go back and you look at that January, I think it's January 5th, 6th in 2020, and everything starts to happen. And then we move into this state of emergency. And on 3/11, the NBA shuts its season down. And on 3/13, Trump declares a state of emergency. And then on 4/13, those two dates are very important because he essentially uncouples every state from the republic during that time. And the reason he says he does this is because not every state can respond to COVID in the same fashion. So for instance, let's say you have Wyoming, which does not have a lot of people in terms of its population. Like Wyoming is not going to respond the same way as New York State. So why should Wyoming be expected to respond in the same way? Well, on the surface, it sounds reasonable, right? But then we saw what happened. We saw these maniacal governors go in and basically run these programs, which were kind of this prototype and a lab experiment as to what it's like to install a very hardcore top-down dictatorial, almost CCP-like government, right? That happened, and we saw the balkanization of the United States. One state's doing one thing, one state's doing another thing, one state's doing one thing, one state's doing another thing. That hasn't changed. Although now you're starting to see some of these states drop their mandates.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
Kind of bring us back. But here's the deal. Biden just renewed the emergency authorization. So we're still in a state of emergency, even though the states say, okay, we're going to do this a different way. We're actually theoretically being run by FEMA and have been run by FEMA since that time. That's what FEMA was set up to do. So until
but even in an emergency, the Constitution is not to be broken. And what Trump did was to show people that those to show, that the power is supposed to be given to the people, and that those governors were supposed to be running their states, and it exposed the ones that were maniacal, to use the word that you used, and it was part of the constitutional education of America. So I really, like you said earlier, I think out of some of these bad things, good things are being learned, and the truth is being exposed to people, although it is painful. Right. And birthing is painful, but there will be good things coming out of this.
Right.
So that's what I'm really seeing now.
It did happen. A lot of people got red pilled. A lot of people got to stay home and go on the internet and search around and figure out, hey, we're getting a raw deal here. Like, what's really going on?
And is this really allowed to happen? No, it's not. And we have rights, and they hopefully will, stand up and vote for someone different and change their leadership in the future. So I think those are kind of the good things that will come out of this.
Well, I think ultimately, this is just me. I'm going to editorialize, but
Sure.
I think ultimately what we have to do is we have to set up parallel systems, because I don't think these people are trustworthy at all.
Right.
And maybe you could flip your city council, or maybe you could flip your local school board, right? I ran for city council, by the way. It's not easy. And there's a lot of
is there anything with the Pluto return and the astrology that shows, like, not only with the financial system or along with the financial system, the political system being destroyed or renewed? You were talking about alternative, maybe the people just walking away from, because we don't trust that anymore,
No, we don't. No.
And so do we look for do we stop giving that our energy and say, well, we're going to build something over here? And does that look like, that our state or our communities are now, the voting is now through a DAO or some alternative system, possibly through blockchain? Can you see things like that with astrology?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we go back to 1776, it's a Declaration of Independence. What happens? People mobilize, and then they throw off the yoke of their theoretical oppressors who will not allow that representation, right? So they're being taxed, but they're not being represented. And this is what starts the whole thing off. And that spirit, even though when you look at some of those characters, some of them are dubious, but that spirit is important, and that's the spirit of our time. Like we're still living with that spirit. And so when we look at the ghost or the ancestral energy of that time, that's also a part of the discussion of what we're having now. So the idea of having a revolution or having something new come out of this is definitely a part of it. And what that looks like and how we integrate some of these new ideas and these new tools that are related to decentralization and can be set up, I think, are really interesting pieces. Can a community redo its city charter? Can it create a local currency? Can that currency be connected to the blockchain? If so, what does it look like? Can you trade volunteer time with your community and put some effort into building your community and have that be translated into some sort of value? Like, these are things that I think are worthy of discussion. And so one of the things that I have kind of had a fantasy about is, like, there are these small towns that are kind of on life support, and maybe they have anywhere between 700 to 1,100 people in those towns. So one of the fantasies that I have is, what would happen if you got a group of people together who had similar ideas, similar values, similar goals and intentions for how they'd like to live life in a more decentralized, truly democratic and creative way? What would happen if you took a seed group of those people and went into a town that was kind of struggling and said, hey, look, we see some potential here, and we have some ideas, some skill sets that may be pretty useful for you. And sit down and talk with them and say, look, you've got electricity, you have water. It looks like you have some other things going on here, but you're on life support. So what would happen if a group of people could come into a place like that and say, we've got some very cool 21st century technology that we'd like to introduce you to. And they're like, well, gee, the car plant or the steel plant or the logging plant or the fishery, they left 15 to 20 years ago, and we're hanging by the skin of our teeth here. What do you got? Like, what do you got? Okay, well, here's what we have. We have things like 3D printing. We have things like, really super, super efficient, solar energy. It's not a solar farm, but we can hook you up, and we can we can make you energy producing, right? We have some interesting things around blockchain and local currencies. And if you could have a meeting of the minds in some of these places, it could be really interesting. Right now, all of a sudden, you get to use a small town that has some infrastructure, who is really looking for something new, and you can like use it as a laboratory, and you can create these new ideas or these new communities based on, you know, some of the tools and technology that we have at our disposal. And that gets into the second house. Like, just for this country, that's the second house. That's a reset around assets, a reset around resources, a reset around this idea of hierarchies, because small towns have hierarchies. I live in one, and they're less visible, but there are hierarchies. But in a time like this, where they have to continue to somehow survive, these ideas, I think, could take root. So I think there's an answer to your question. And I would encourage people to look at these models, because if we're going to create parallel systems through this Pluto return and have a revolution, right, and have revolutionary ideas, and to step apart from what all intents and purposes looks very similar to the same system that the English were running during that 1776 period, where, by the way, you couldn't own anything. You couldn't have land ownership during that time. So one of the good things that comes out of the American Revolution is land ownership, right? They fought for that. These guys fought for land ownership. Before that, you were a vassal and you didn't own anything. And maybe if you were lucky, you were able to swing a deal and somehow, you know, buy a title for your kid or something. And therefore you'd be connected to some form of the oligarchy, in which case you might be able to own your property. But this is what's happening now, right? Like, you have BlackRock buying up all this land. You have all these people running freaking Airbnbs. You can't even buy a home. You're getting outbid by Airbnb consortiums. So this whole idea of you'll own nothing and be happy takes us right back to why people revolted in 1776. It's the same principles. Mm-hmm. So the revolution has to take place in a different kind of way with different ideas. And there's no way, like, you could go musket for musket back then and you'd have a chance. Like, we can't go musket for musket now, because our muskets are not equal to their muskets. Like,
well, and we've already said that it's an information war this time. And we've discussed that, where the way that they're having power over us right now is by misleading and disinformation, and that we are really untethered from what's going on, because we're being fed so many stories. And that's where you were saying, like, it's a time to be untethered and not be too connected to, or have your feet too firm into what you think you're seeing, because we know we're being misled. That's probably the only thing that we can really, lean on, is that we know we're getting fed at least several lines of different stories. So as far as astrology and the charts show, what does astrology say about what the next most powerful country in the world would be? Would it be India, or who?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Before I answer that, I want to give you a couple more Pluto dates, because I've been looking that up while you've been talking. So there is another Pluto retrograde that takes place in 2023, and it takes place when Pluto goes into the sign of Aquarius, actually. And that Pluto retrograde happens fairly early in that transit. So that's in May. And May is associated with the second house and money and assets. Like, that's where the United States Pluto is. It's in the second house. So there's a retrograde that happens in May at 0 Aquarius. And then we have Pluto going all the way back one final time to that 27 degree, and that's in September of 2023. And then it comes back and it goes direct one final time. It's going to come back over Pluto to go direct one final time before that transit is over with. And that's going to be in October, which is so it's October is really interesting, because this year in October, 2022 in October, Pluto goes direct again. And then it goes direct one more time in October in 2023, separated by 2 days. So it'd be the 9th of October in 2022, and then the 11th of October in 2023, both at 27 degrees. So those are very specific dates. And the direct motion could be the final, like, okay, this is the reset, right? We're coming into this reset period, reset cycle, after we've gone through this final retrograde period where we're being disassembled, because that's what a retrograde cycle does. It begins to disassemble things and kind of retrofit. So those are very important dates. Now, in terms of your question, a country that I think it's pretty much a no-brainer is China, because China is an Aquarius rising country, and it's really early Aquarius. So when we had that super conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, that happened right on China's ascendant. So that means China's ascending, literally. And that's a 20-year cycle. So this next 20-year cycle for China is pretty significant. It's a very significant cycle. Russia, by the way, if you look at Russia's chart as it reformed, it becomes a Capricorn country, which means that it's the opposite of the U.S., because the U.S. is a Cancerian country. So they have this interesting kind of twin relationship going on, but they're not twins in the sense that they're really together, but they're twins in terms of oppositional energy. But in astrology, there's a thing called progressions, and the progressed chart for Russia is Aquarius. So, Aquarius is very, very different than, say, Capricorn, because Aquarius is related to destruction. So what we're seeing here with Russia and Ukraine, whatever we can believe, Russia's performing this Aquarian role, because they're going in and we're seeing the destruction of the money system, or we're seeing the destruction of this. The world used to be multipolar, but now it's kind of being morphed back into a unipolar world, but only because they want to use the unipolarity for more destruction. But that's the role Russia's playing now. They're playing this strange Aquarian role, and it's creative destruction. That's where they're at. So they're actually a country to be looked at in terms of the global game. In terms of India, I've taken a look at India's chart before. They've got a lot of different charts. Let's take a quick gander here. Let me just take a look at it, because they have a number of different charts based on all these variations of their constitution, reconstitution. A lot of countries have that. So what I have here for India is they're a Leo country. August 15th, 1947. That's when they gained independence from the Brits. So they're Leo. Their rising sign is Gemini, which is kind of interesting. When you think of India, what do you think of? You think of call centers, right? Which is very Gemini. It's like, okay, we're going to take your calls, and we're going to play the customer service country, right? That's very Gemini rising. They have a lot of Leo energy in their chart. Here, I'll pull it up so people can see if they're interested.
Yeah, I've got it pulled up.
If you want to share it, is it the Astro theme chart?
Yeah. Okay, it's whatever you have shared within the StreamYard.
Yep. So it's so we have Gemini rising, and then a lot of Leo planets: Mars in Leo, Moon in Leo, Mercury in Leo, Pluto in Leo, Saturn in Leo. So there's a lot of pride there. And what's also interesting too is that India is a country that still practices a caste system. It's still there. So when we think of a caste system, we do think of things like Leo, right? Because Leo represents royalty. We have the Rajas who are at the top of the caste system, right? And it's still kind of intact. But if you go to the other side, we see this Aquarian midheaven. And India has played a role in the 20th century, big time in terms of technology, whether it's call centers or bringing Indian workers here through work visas, and working for Google or working for Amazon. And the head of Twitter was born in India. Now it's not really the head of Twitter, but he's like he went from being the CTO to the CEO. Well, he's born in India, right? And so here we have Aquarius on the midheaven. So they're playing a role. And if you look at where Saturn is, Saturn right now is just conjuncted the Indian midheaven, which is a pretty auspicious time for India. So the thing with India that I think is interesting is how do they move into the 21st century, and how do they move into decentralization while abandoning this idea of this modified caste system, which I think they still have. I think that's their big issue and their big challenge. And they've aligned themselves with China. They've aligned themselves with Russia in the whole BRICS thing. I think they've openly said, we're going to a digital currency, but it's going to be our digital currency. It's not going to be decentralized. So that's the dichotomy here with India, because they're supposed to fulfill some kind of Aquarian mission to the world. But Leo is such a fixed sign. It doesn't want to let go of power. It doesn't want to let go of its hierarchy in some ways. Like we're going to be autocratic. We're going to be oligarchs. But somehow we have to rebrand so we can control this decentralized platform that we're moving into with the world. So I think they have some challenges. I think India has challenges. And one of the big challenges is when Pluto moves into the sign of Aquarius. I think that's a big, it looks like, I'm sorry, I apologize. It looks like they have Mars in Cancer. I apologize for that. They have Mercury. This is the first time I've looked at this chart. So they have Mercury, Pluto, Venus, Saturn, Sun. Those are all in Leo. So they will have a Pluto opposition with Mercury. And that's going to happen, let's see, 2025, right around there. So Pluto is then going to work over India. They're going to go through a Pluto opposition. That'll be interesting. I think India could have problems with their people during that time.
Interesting.
I think they could have their own revolution. Go ahead.
Yeah. So with this said, I was just thinking back to one of the things you said earlier where we were going through and with this Aquarius thing going from, you were talking horizontal, and then we were talking about being more global. And then we had a reading with Susan Hudd, who is a psychic, and she talked about maybe later this month some of a big political change, big political upheaval in the U.S., Canada, UK, Scotland. I don't have my notes with me, but a bunch of different. If a country were to restructure, and let's say the United States, Mexico, and Canada all merge in some way and kind of create a new country, change their stars, would you say, would that create a new astrology for that new entity?
Absolutely. Yeah,
okay.
For sure. Yeah. What's interesting about Canada's astrological chart is really similar in some ways to the United States' astrological chart. So Canada is a Cancerian country, just like the United States is. We're Cancerian cousins. Mexico's different, but yeah, I mean, they've been trying to, create these economic zones.
I'm just thinking about the whole patriot movement and how the word patriot, we've had this conversation on my channel where the word patriot typically was, and I'm an American, so we're a little egocentric with the whole patriot movement. But then to watch what happened in Canada, we all have said, look at those patriots. And that word itself has been now kind of globalized. And now they're even using it with Ukrainians, regardless of what you think is going on over there. We're just talking about language and the use of it. It's now, oh, look at the patriotic Ukrainians fighting for their country with what you're seeing on the news. And so I'm thinking about, if we are globalizing and we're changing the stars of these countries and our countries, if we do the Trump USMCA and make America great again, and USMCA becomes America, then it has a whole new chart, and the destiny of the Pluto return at some point gets stopped in its tracks, or or it's part of the Pluto return. Or it's part of
right?
the Pluto recurrent. Yeah, and it's the death of whenever the old part dies, then there's the birth of the new, and the good part comes out of the bad part dying, or whatever that looks
Right.
like.
Well,
I don't know.
that's yeah.
Does
Pluto's
that make
connected to the
sense?
Pluto's connected to the Phoenix. And if you go back and look at some of the writings and cliff notes of the founding fathers, they actually wanted to make the Phoenix the bird of the United States. And they thought, well, this is a little too occulty and esoteric. Let's settle on the eagle. So this
Well, and
idea of
what's on The Economist
it's
for
the Phoenix, right? It's the
that
Phoenix. It comes
famous
out of the New
issue?
Order.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So the Phoenix plays a role in the sort of the bedrock of the United States. If you look at the United States chart, Pluto's the first planet that we encounter in the chart. So that first planet is a big planet. Like the first planet and the highest planet in a person's chart are kind of signatories in the chart. The first planet sets the tone because that's the first planet the individual has access to in their chart. The highest planet, which is at the apex, is the planet that person in that chart is aspiring towards, like is guiding them towards their ascent as an individual into the world. So in the United States, we're dealing with Pluto in the first house. So we're dealing with things that are very Plutonian and transformational. And then Neptune represents this spiritual ideal, right? That's what Neptune is. So we're trying to aspire towards, like come here and you're able to practice whatever you want to practice in terms of your religion and your faith and your spirituality. So they're two very interesting planets. They're both outer planets. They're not inner planets. So we're dealing with big, deep, institutional, kind of transplanetary ideas and ideals that are part of this country. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, and it's amazing. And I could talk to you forever. I have to get going because I've got another show here in just a little while. But I would love to meet with you again sometime if you'd honor us with that and share some more. I've got probably a whole nother page of questions.
Yeah, I mean, I hope this was helpful, and it gave you some insight and backstory to what we're talking about with Pluto, and hopefully connected to some of these larger changes. So whenever you want me, just hit me up. I'm here for you.
Thank you for coming on today.
You're welcome. Have a great day.
You guys make sure to check out Robert's channels, and he's got a website over here at robertphoenix.com. And then also, Robert, will you put up your, did you take it down? What was your daily show?
Yeah, it's called 15 Minutes of Flame, OV. 15 minutes of flame, like 15 minutes of fame. But instead of fame, it's flame. Instead of, it's OV. And 15 is like
OV.
Yeah, 15 minutes of flame.
Flame.com. Yeah. Why can I not be reached? I'm doing something wrong.
Let's Google it.
I thought I did Google it.
It should come up. Here, I have a link for you. I'll just do a quick screen share.
Yeah, we'll do
just a really quick screen share.
That would be easier. Thanks.
Yeah, let's just no problem. I have it up here.
Make sure everybody sees 15 minutes OV flame.
Yeah, right there.
Perfect. So make sure you go and check those out. And remember that SL has her free Telegram channel that you can follow. And then check out her Patreon. There's all the links in the description below for all of this, for all three of us. So thank you guys for joining us. I'll be on my happy hour here in about 30 minutes or so. So thanks, guys. Have a great day.